Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is Brock Beard from lastcar.info, and welcome to a special Easter evening edition of Behind the Wall. Thank you again, everyone, for tuning in. Hope you've had a wonderful Easter. And we come to you tonight after the conclusion of the Toyota Owners 400 at Richmond, where everyone is mad. Everyone is so mad, and my headphones are falling off. This has been just a crazy couple of days. Who would have thought coming into this race weekend that the angriest drivers we would see would have been Joey Gase and Martin Truex Jr., but that's certainly the scenario that we find ourselves in at this moment. A bizarre set of circumstances, to say the least. An unfortunate overtime restart, which incidentally ended up creating the most laps completed by a last place finisher at Richmond. This after last year, where everybody finished within 5 laps of the leader. We somehow improved on that even in this one. But we had Martin Truex Jr. on his way to another dominant victory at Richmond, well-deserved. Took the lead back from Kyle Larson after Larson beat him off pit road, showing some tremendous aggression out there. Not long after, in fact, him cutting laps out at the home track here at the Sonoma Raceway earlier this week, was looking to be on his way to victory. A race that Kyle Larson did very well in at the very beginning of this. Denny Hamlin and Joey Logano were kind of working their way up there. Logano seemed to be having a bit more of the advantage over Hamlin there, tracking down Kyle Larson in the final laps. You know, it was going to be at least a satisfactory conclusion, if not the most, certainly not the most action-packed race here at what was historically known as the action track. However, again, it was going to be kind of at least something closer to what we had at Las Vegas with Tyler Reddick trekking down Larson. Logano looked like he was going to just come up short there in the last couple of laps, and then wouldn't you know it, for some reason, it's always Bubba Wallace and Kyle Larson. It seems like whenever the two of these drivers get near each other, there's some kind of altercation, whether it's the Las Vegas deal from a couple of years ago or whatever else here, and it's unfortunately just hard racing, I guess you could say, from what was happening there coming on to the front straightaway. And so we had to do another overtime finish, and suddenly everybody's got to come in and get tires, and Denny Hamlin is now leading everybody off of pit road and coming to his home track and everything, where Hamlin hadn't really been a factor the entire evening, hadn't really had the lead until one point a little bit before that late race restart. And now there's controversy over that as well. Seeing replays on the Fox broadcast where it looked like Denny Hamlin was at least starting to roll ahead of Truex coming into the Geico restart zone, at least before the line. And it would have been great if we saw more angles of it. The front angle, I mean, it really looked like he definitely had a bit more of an advantage over the 19 and was able to kind of carry that through. Truex did a great job keeping alongside him there on that final restart. I didn't like that the Fox broadcast, in its infinite wisdom, whenever it comes with one of these rule situations, they're kind of like, yeah, he did, but he was still alongside him. It's like, well, okay, what's the rule? Like, it's an unfortunate situation there, but just a whole confluence of things coming down the stretch there. But Denny Hamlin picks up another win at his home track. Truex is absolutely not happy there. I see the frustration with Larson, maybe to an extent with the bringing out the caution, but more directly, the fact they were kind of riding each other on the outside of the wall there with some heavy contact there, and then a bit more after the race there. I think, again, much more like Larson himself described, I think Truex was just upset at that point, and you can't really blame him. That's a brutal way to lose, and Denny Hamlin should know that as well. You think back to that famous finish there with Dale Jr. and Kyle Busch spinning each other out in 2008. That was a race that Hamlin himself had dominated, leading, I believe, 381 laps of that one, and had a flat tire that set up the scenario for both of them, and then ultimately Clint Bowyer to take the victory. All three of those drivers were completely out to lunch in that race, which is something that gets kind of overlooked there too. But an unfortunate deal there, on all fronts. Again, yeah, I think with the Bubba Wallace, Kyle Larson thing, yeah, I agree. It was just kind of, the just hard racing there at the end. And everybody's trying to get whatever they can get in the last couple of laps. I think we had some decent battles among the top 5, what we were able to see when the Fox broadcast wasn't actively looking for something else to kind of point at us. But just brutal, just a brutal situation there. And Truex is definitely a driver that, it kind of reminds me of Bobby Labonte back in the day, a driver where, if something disappointing happens, you'll see the person like kick their car, like, the 2005 600, or that famous shot of Bobby getting out of his car at Bristol and kicking it after it's leaking fluid down the track. Truex kind of reminds me of that a little bit. I think his sense of disappointment definitely comes across from this, but he should be just as tough next week at Martinsville, and he may very well just roll over the competition there as well. And it's just going to be a matter of what happens down the stretch. Just a bizarre way to have this particular race play out, I think, and not the only outrageous thing that happened in this race, of course. Social media has been doing a great job, I think, cataloging the many things from this, whether it was just the broadcast, just the overall quality of the broadcast versus the Kyle Busch caution that didn't need to be a caution that completely screwed up what was going to be a very interesting pit strategy race. We've seen in recent years, especially with the next-gen car, that's the one saving grace of Richmond, is that it's become one of the only really good strategy races this year, especially since stage cautions have kind of taken that away from the road courses. But at Richmond, you never know what's going to happen. Somebody short pits and blast through the field. We saw that in the Xfinity Series race yesterday as well, with the charge of Brennan Poole through stage 1. It's unfortunate that a lot of that got kind of turned on its ear with a caution that really didn't need to happen. Kyle Busch, his car goes straight, bounces off the wall. Very minor contact for what we would consider even at an incident at Richmond. He didn't spin out. He didn't, have a brake rotor explode on him or anything like that. Just got a little bit out of line, bounced off the wall and kept going. And before he could even roll off the wall and get back up to speed, the caution lights are already on because NASCAR is just that desperate for a caution, I suppose. Really unfortunate because we had something very interesting going on there with people splitting the stages in different ways and wanting to see it play out. And obviously, that could still happen if you have an actual caution that's going to just naturally come out, and it could turn everything on its ear. If somebody, did have a mechanical failure or something like that, or did get in an accident, could have just as easily happened there. But throwing the caution freely there is definitely something that was, not a positive from this too. And then you can also look at the short track package and what effect that this has had on Richmond. I think this is a track between Richmond and Martinsville, of the short tracks on the schedule, ones that people have been most concerned about, as to the quality of the racing. Now, again, I think the strategy, in spite of the Kyle Busch, non-caution that came out, was still really interesting to follow in this. And I think if the broadcast wanted to show us more of the field and maybe track some other things that were happening, I'm glad at one point they were showing Carson Hocevar back in like the 20s or something like that for a little bit. But I would have liked to see a lot more of that, or through the field or something, because there's always something going on out there. Again, the last place battle in this race in particular was really intense. Pretty much changed hands all the way until I think the last 50 laps of this race there too. So even people that were further back in the pack had something to compete for. I just feel like that wasn't really shown very well. I think Richmond has had a long history of not being broadcast very well, especially in the post Car of Tomorrow era. Somehow a lot of the action track era stuff, when they had the sealer on the surface, it just kind of has gone away, and it's unfortunate. I think they just need to kind of go back to square one and really kind of see a better way to show some more of the action on the track, because I think a lot does happen. And we saw some of that at the beginning of this race with the damp tire package out there and running the wet tires for the beginning of the race, and that added an extra layer of intrigue to it. I know certainly at the back of the field, it was still very tight during this. This was definitely a challenging race to cover when you have the last place thing up in the air for like the entire distance. I will admit that watching the race, I have a hard time actually kind of focusing on a lot of what was happening there. But what I was seeing was definitely very competitive racing when we saw it. People going 3 wide. I mean, Justin Haley at one point there was starting in the last spot, And seconds after the green flag, he was already in a 3-wide battle at the inside of a couple other drivers. And that was just the back of the pack. And you saw people searching around trying to find the right line. Listening to one driver on the radio pointing out that a lot of drivers had trouble finding where the groove was on the track, where the track was wet versus where it was dry. It added an extra layer of intrigue. And I think one of the folks over at PRN did a great job pointing this out too. It allowed the race to start a half hour earlier than it would have ordinarily. I mean, and I think the Fox booth echoed this as well. Because otherwise we would have been just waiting at the beginning of this for them to actually dry the track and get the thing started. And that would have just been ridiculous, especially when it's already on Easter at night and being, delayed by weather already. So I applaud NASCAR for at least having that. And I think that this is a nice, method there to shortcut a track where maybe there's just a lot of, this would have been great. I guess it wouldn't really work at a track like Texas. I was thinking back to the race where the mist was a big factor and messing up the start of that race there. I mean, obviously this is intended much more for short tracks there. But again, I think that was a positive. What was a problem with it though, and again, everything that always seems to be a positive has a drawback to it. I echo Jeff Gluck's concerns there as well, where teams weren't allowed to switch over to slick tires when they felt like it. They couldn't just run them a little bit longer. And again, to see that, maybe they run quicker, but they deteriorate faster and try to factor that into it. That would have been really interesting to see if we could see the field actually run them a bit longer, try to get better track position, especially if they didn't qualify very well, knowing that you have the end of the stage coming up. But unfortunately, instead, we had a competition caution called on lap 30. Everybody comes in and changes tires, and that just gets eliminated altogether. I mean, NASCAR seemed very anti-strategy in this one, which is unfortunate because with this package or any other short track package they've had with the next gen car, again, I think that's been the major draw of this event. Used to be, with the older cars, that it would be a fuel mileage race like a Michigan or a California. But I think Richmond has kind of found this extra element there too. So yeah, it's unfortunate that worked out that way. I think this race was a bit over officiated there. I think it could even probably be argued that Kyle Larson's spin probably shouldn't have been a caution either. And they could have just kept it going to the finish. Larson did a great job. He drove through the grass, but he kind of found a spot on the apron to get back on the track there too. But it is what it is, I guess, at that point there. Very light on action in terms of the overall race itself. Daniel Suarez being spun out in the early laps there by Josh Berry, who himself had another fantastic race in this one here, showing that run at Bristol was absolutely no fluke. And with very different results on the tires and very different racetrack here, still showed a tremendous performance out there. I think this was right up there with that. Also showing that, his runner-up finish driving Chase Elliott's car was also no fluke at the same time. We obviously saw Elliott have his solid run in this one, finishing 5th, although not really as much of a factor in the finish. Josh Berry coming home in the 11th spot, just ahead of Noah Gragson. Fine job there for him there. I think a good turnaround there too. Mentioning Bubba Wallace earlier and the incident with Kyle Larson, as was illustrated during the broadcast there, an unfortunate problem on pit road dropped him further back. Wallace ends up 13th. That's a real shame because I think really he was showing a lot of endurance out there with very distracting brake shake that for whatever reason has affected the 2311 team in particular. Not, one of his best tracks on the circuit here, but regardless was in and out of like the top 5 or top 10 most of this race. And ends up, the finish will not reflect that, unfortunately. But we'll see how things turn around for him in Martinsville. I remember he was very good there with the Petty Enterprises, or Richard Petty Motorsports effort, rather, in the earlier part of his career there in the 43. So we'll see if that carries over next week. But again, unofficially your race results here. Denny Hamlin, your winner. Joey Logano, 269 thousandths of a second behind. Kyle Larson in 3rd, Truex 4th, and Chase Elliott. So especially for Elliott and Logano, great turnaround this year. I guess we've seen a little bit better out of Elliott already this year, but the broadcast really was leaning on Logano for having such a difficult start to his season. And this was definitely a track that I didn't expect that to turn around at, especially where the margin for error is so narrow with your strategy and long green flag runs and so forth. But regardless, a fine finish there. Christopher Bell was going to be up there as well, ends up being sixth with a pit road penalty there towards the end of the race that really sabotaged what would have been easily a top 5 run again for him. After that fine run over at Coda. Speaking of Coda, your Coda winner, William Byron, in the 7th spot, Brad Keselowski 8th with his RFK teammate Chris Buescher in 9th, and Tyler Reddick in the 10th spot there again. So 23, 11, 10th, and 13th at the checkered flag here. Looking through the rest of the results here, Eric Jones was at the back of the field for a lot of the opening laps. I think stage 1, transitioning into stage 2, he kind of dropped back in the lineup there, finishes back in the 14th position there. We saw a bit of Ross Chastain trying to stay on the lead lap there in the closing stages. He finishes 15th. Ty Gibbs' top 10 streak ends. He finishes in the 16th spot here. Alex Bowman, we saw a bit of frustration out of him with his battle with Martin Truex Jr. near the end of, I believe it was stage 2, where Bowman was trying to hang on to the lead lap himself. Truex battled him back there, and Bowman still had the lucky dog, of course, but a slightly different result there for him, finishing back in the 17th spot. Chase Briscoe, Ryan Blaney, and Kyle Busch after that devastating hit to the outside wall, which really shouldn't have drawn anything there, was a 20th place finisher there at the same time. Suarez ended up being your last car on the lead lap in the 22nd spot there after his spin off of the nose of Josh Berry. Cindric was the first driver off the lead lap. We saw him getting passed by the leaders there in the closing stages. Jonathan Nemechek in 25th, Hocevar in 27th. And then this kind of leads into our last place feature here at the end of this. Probably one of the craziest ones I've seen. I mean, I think about the All-Star race at Texas where nobody fell out of the race, and there were pretty much the positions changed every lap because they were running the 550 package in 2021. That was pretty crazy all the way through Hamlin pulling down pit road short of the finish to make sure he didn't have a penalty against his crew chief there for loose lug nuts back then. But this was taken to a whole different level here. We did see again last July that BJ McLeod finished in last place at Richmond while finishing under power. He was 5 laps down to the race leader. But however, this time around here, LaJoie was almost going to be in that same situation. Corey LaJoie dropping to the back of the field there in about the second half of the race, and ends up finishing 3 laps down in the unofficial results here. And also finishing in overtime, he actually completed 404 laps, which is, of course, more than the full race distance, which beats the 2019 record set by Eric Jones, where he finished 4th and infamously was disqualified for a technical infraction that ended up costing him an advance in the playoffs there back when he was driving for Joe Gibbs. And Jones ended up credited with 400 laps complete, but a disqualification. It's incredible to see a race finish in overtime where the last place finisher actually completed more laps than that. I was kind of willing to leave that out of the statistics and just focus on BJ's statistic there for much of this race, but then that ended up turning out very differently. We saw several drivers competing for last place throughout the race. It was changed between both colleague drivers, with Ty Dillon jumping on board a car that really didn't seem like it had sponsorship. It just ran the Chevy Accessories logos on there, which, as we saw with Ross Chastain when he drove for Chip Ganassi before they closed, kind of an indicator of perhaps some issues with single race sponsors that weren't quite fulfilled this year for the colleague effort. Regardless, Ty Dillon getting an effort with that team for 5 races this year, this being the first of those, driving in the number 16. He and Daniel Hemrick traded the spot several times at several points. They were side by side and decided by hundredths or thousandths of a second at points there. We also saw both the Rick Ware cars battling for that position between Kaz Gralla and Justin Haley. Haley was seemed to be set for being your last place finisher about 3/4 of the way through this race before LaJoie got down there. Zane Smith had a late race pit stop that kind of dropped him back in the lineup there and seemed like he was about to take the spot from LaJoie, but LaJoie would not be beaten. I believe that's now his 11th last place finish in the Cup Series, his first of this season, and definitely creates another scenario there. First last place run for the number 7 at Richmond since 2000, when Michael Waltrip drove that great Nations Rent paint scheme for the Matei Motorsports effort, which became Ultra Motorsports the next year. So a little bit of history there at the same time. But pretty much between the Rick Ware team, the Colleague team, and the Spire Motorsports team, pretty much had a free-for-all for last place for this entire race. Even Ryan Preece and Michael McDowell at one point or another threw their hats into the rig there for Stuart Haas and Front Row Motorsports at the same time, too. Harrison Burton ends up finishing in the 34th spot. He never actually took last place, but was very much in the mix there, too. So, kind of a different deal here. So, I think, it's unfortunate. I think, again, every one of these races, I'm thinking about it from the perspective of some of these newer fans that are getting brought into it through the Netflix show here. I think this was the best of times and worst of times for of a Richmond race here with, again, long green flag runs and seeing some strategy, then some kind of meddling from the officiating body there with some cautions that didn't really need to be cautions that kind of screwed that up. You had, and then you had at least a pretty good battle with people working their way through traffic at the end, because you had a run that was long enough for people like Logano and Hamlin to march their way up there. And that was pretty cool to see. And then you get an overtime finish that ultimately strips the win away from the most dominant driver and ends up giving it to somebody that really wasn't a factor for most of this race, despite it being, his home track. I'm not sure where. I think it's probably a good crash course, although there weren't really any crashes involved in the race really till the finish of it here. In just seeing, kind of, again, the best and worst of a NASCAR race here along the way. But also you can see the frustrations about the package, the frustration about, the way that the competition here is at the track. I would love to cover a race at Richmond, because I do get the feeling, and I get the similar feeling about Dover, that there's a lot of really competitive racing that we're just not seeing. And this goes back to my favorite angle that I like to approach here, and that's the broadcast. I think I found during this broadcast in particular, the crank it up segments where nobody was talking were probably some of the best parts of this, unfortunately. The crew was they were trying to do the best they could under the circumstances when, it seemed like there, wasn't necessarily like side by side for the lead all day or anything like that. You would have the leader, stretch out a pretty big advantage. You'd have people kind of spread out through there. But again, I think that when that happens, that's where you really need to bring up more stories through the field. And I felt like there was a little bit of an impulse towards that, like we saw with Carson Hocevar very briefly. I mean, it was a very brief moment there, but it really needed to kind of be a larger part of that. I think that would have been much more enjoyable. And even if it's not the most competitive race, maybe you still have something to say about a good portion of the field. I mean, there were some paint schemes that we never even saw in this race, which is, I think, another measure of how much of the field is shown. I didn't realize John Hunter Nemechek was still running the Safeway paint scheme until pretty much the end of the race there at one point, seeing him on pit road. Things like that. I think those are things where you have to really use everything in your tool bag. You don't have to show some segment where Denny Hamlin is sitting there and thinking about racing at Richmond in the past. You don't have to do, showing footage, as funny as it was from the Richmond go-kart race there with Jeff Gordon and the Looney Tunes and stuff like that. I mean, that's fun, but it was all within the context of, this advertisement for the podcast that Kevin Harvick's doing. These are all segments that would fit fine in a pre-race show. They don't really need to be during the race. During the race, whilst, especially under green flag conditions, you should be really tracking like anything that's happening and just trying to hustle up any stories you can get, if somebody's having a mechanical issue or something like that. And I know it's very challenging, especially at a race like this where there was so little attrition. We didn't even have anybody go to the garage area. Everybody that lost laps did so on the track. Nobody even lost a lap, I think, until after the first stage was over with, when Corey LaJoie got caught right before the next round of green flag stops there. So it was, you got to be resourceful. And there's a lot of tools at your disposal, whether it's the scanner or whether it's other camera angles or just looking at, and just really the whole field. Use the actual field there and try to bring up, in the history of the track, the history of the sport. I mean, anything you can bring into it. I still feel like there's a lack of willingness to do that. I think they're just looking for the short-term gain with some of these segments there. So, it's unfortunate. I think that's really the situation. There were a lot of angles still that were way too close to the cars, so you couldn't really see how people were competing. Even, again, when you had the rain tires at the beginning, I think it would have been nice if they used a lot more distance shots and actually show, how different, the cars are running around the track. Where they talked about people being dirt trackers and hugging the outside wall. That's great. But, actually really feature that. And actually, when you switch to the dry tires, show the difference. Show that, that this is a different approach and that these drivers have to really adjust on the fly to running this race very differently on a different set of tires and see it visually. They do this stuff with the ghost cars and stuff like that. And I liked that they did a little bit of that at the Xfinity race to show the tire drop off, because I think that's another big factor at this track. But it needed to be much more. I think if they leaned into that a lot more, it would have been really interesting to see there. So, again, I think this is a challenging race to broadcast. Probably is one of the most challenging, I'd say, between the different strategies at play, how important tires are, how important track position is, how common long green flag runs are and dominant runs, and low attrition. This race had it all. And then to throw on top of this overtime finish here that scrambled things up even more. The unfortunate reality is pretty much any review of this race is going to just focus on that overtime finish and just leave everything else out. And, that's too bad, because I think that, there's a lot they have to work with. And unfortunately, for those of us who are not at the track, that's all we have to base it on. I mean, we got social media and try to see, anybody that's in the garage area or anybody that's in the media center picking up other stories there along the way. But other than that, I mean, that's really all, we're working off. You have to kind of almost do your own work to kind of get some more information about what's actually happening during one of these races. So, again, it was a tricky, tricky deal there, but yeah, I think more than anything, the outcome of the race is probably the most surprising part of it. I don't think any of us expected that Truex was going to lose this race. And if he was going to lose it, it was probably going to be to Kyle Larson for how good he was in the first stage. But then Larson had dropped back a bit after he got beat by Truex coming off of their last green flag stops. The 19 just seemed hell-bent to actually pull off that victory. And I know that traditionally, you have a situation where, somebody's, the fastest car doesn't always win. You hear about that in NASCAR, and that's one of the best things about the sport. But you don't want that to happen all the time either. You don't want it to be a point where you don't have an incentive to go out there and just whoop the field. If you lead 3/4 of the race and you're leading by 5 seconds, that shouldn't be, people shouldn't turn up their nose up at that quite as much. And I would include the NASCAR officiating for that too. Sometimes that happens, and that's what makes an exciting race or an exciting finish that much more so, because it's not the most common thing. Some tracks or circumstances are just going to be different. And I think the unpredictability of not knowing what's going to happen is always there. But again, if sometimes the race is already, the story is pretty much written before you get to halfway, and that's just the way it plays out. And I think in NASCAR history, whatever era you look at, there's going to be a lot more races like that than the opposite for sure. Again, I think I'm kind of trying to figure out where to fit this in the rankings from like this season. I think the Phoenix race actually had a bit more going on that we saw, at least, than this race here. I liked that in that one we had pretty much each of these different Toyota teams being dominant at different points. That we had a couple of incidents. You had kind of the shocker of Denny Hamlin spinning out when he was competing for the lead. Again, another race that had very low attrition, at least after the early Austin Cindric accident. Kind of an interesting way that played out. I felt like I was more engaged in what was happening in that race versus this one here. Part of that probably was because the last place battle was settled so early in that race, so I'll admit some bias there. But I'm not sure if I'd rank this race ahead of that. in that respect, despite the fact that the finish was, crazy and you had some controversy there. Not only, Truex losing the race, but then, of course, Denny Hamlin possibly jumping the start there at the end of it. It's it's frustrating when you have some of these overtime finishes because it feels like it just disturbs the natural rhythm of these races at some points. And some points that just happens anyway. Again, I think it would be foolish to expect that every week. This craving for cautions and craving for overtime. And apparently this being the first overtime finish of the year, I thought that was itself probably one of the most surprising things. I could have sworn that Atlanta or Vegas or something had overtime, but it didn't. So I guess that maybe we are already on the right track and it's not that big of a thing either. But I'm not exactly sure. I was seeing your comment there, Big G, about NASCAR not liking to show cars unless they pay a ransom to be shown. I don't know anything about that. It wouldn't surprise me because it almost seems like it does play out that way. But yeah. But we'll see if that's going to be the situation. Let's see here. Kind of looking at some of the other comments here too. Jumping the start is savvy, apparently. Yeah, exactly. It's like, breaking the rules. We'll definitely talk about that, about the Xfinity Series race too, because we definitely got a lot to talk about that at the same time here. Yeah, clean start, one veteran more savvy than the other. I mean, again, it's so borderline, at least from the replay they showed. I hope we get to see some more replays of that last restart, because maybe we'll see one that's going to be much more flagrant of how much of an advantage Hamlin had. I mean, again, like I said, Truex did a great job keeping up with Hamlin there and making a race out of it. Clearly, he was frustrated and still trying to clear him, and at least fought him 3/4 of the way around the track. It just wasn't meant to be there, and at that point, once he lost the lead, it was open season. You had Logano and Larson coming after him. And, at that point, you're just in an awful situation. No matter how fresh your tires are, you're just going to get run over. And he found himself in that situation. And the more frustrated you get, you overdrive the car. And then you end up with, it's like playing a video game here or a simulator or something. Somebody, he almost rage quit the finish, and you can see the anger there at the end. And I think that's another big theme to talk about from this weekend. I think that probably the one thing that will get brought up from this, and maybe that will be the positive in the wash, despite everything that happened before it, is showing some real emotion from these drivers. We saw Martin Truex, vent his frustrations there at the end. I thought he was very composed in his post-race interview under the circumstances. That was pretty surprising. Not really surprising from him personally, because he never seems to really show emotion that clearly, other than disappointment, really, I would say. Again, I think that people seeing that response and showing that, when somebody gets beat and it's under circumstances they're not happy with, they're going to show that. And, whether it's bumping into Larson or bumping into Hamlin or whatever, again, it happens out on the track. Again, no harm, no foul on that. I hope NASCAR doesn't get hypercritical of all that and look at what happened there and just understand that, there's, when you create this format where winning matters more than anything else, and you don't know how many chances you're going to get to pull off a victory. I mean, nobody can really be guaranteed of that. Or your chance of getting multiple wins in a season. I think that's another thing to certainly take under consideration. I think that it's a little bit insincere to put all this pressure on these drivers, and when they're already running with their heart rate pegged, and it's still way too hot in the car despite all of the air circulating in there and the advancements made on that. The car is stiff and it's hard to handle, and they're still figuring it out, and you're running all these different tracks. I mean, there's a tremendous amount of stress and burdens that are put on these drivers if we just allowed them to express themselves and vent that a bit. and just be themselves. NASCAR is constantly trying to have its cake and eat it too when it comes to these circumstances. We saw it last year with Denny Hamlin doing the podcast and saying that, look, I'm, Ross, if you catch up to me, I mean, you're coming with me. I'm going to, I'm going to go in the wall. You're going to go in the wall with me. And that's what ended up happening. It's like, okay, well, I mean, that happens, but I mean, does it require, some huge, ridiculous penalty and all this absurdity when at the same time it's something that it's like, well, I mean, these are drivers expressing themselves. These are, you don't want it to devolve into a full-on demolition derby, obviously. You don't want to belittle the safety aspect of it there. But short of that, when it's just hard racing and maybe one guy slips up and it puts the other guy in the wall, I think when in Hamlin's situation from that whole Phoenix deal, that's the kind of way I took it. It's like, well, Hamlin knew his car was out of control and he's on the last lap and he's also got Chastain trying to make a move around him. It's like, well, buddy, there's not much more I can do. And, if I'm going in the wall, you're going to be going there too. I didn't take that to really even mean intentional. I just think it's just, you're not doing anything to, you can only do so much in that moment. And these are the gray areas that we're finding, things all the time. And this transitions perfectly into what was easily the biggest story of this weekend. And the reason that I brought out my Joey Gase shirt here again from his Jimmy Means, throwback here at the same time. We are facing that very same situation from the Gase-Cram Joey Gase incident that happened in Saturday's race. Now, for those of you who didn't see it, first of all, I mean, the clips have been pretty much everywhere. So you put in either of those drivers' names and it'll probably be the first thing that comes up. To provide a bit of the historical context, Gase-Cram did drive for Emmerling Gase Motorsports earlier in his career. He made his first Darlington start for the Emmerling Gase team. Had a pretty solid run, if I seem to remember correctly. It was not his first overall start. Cram actually started out driving for Mike Harmon before that. Now, this year, the Emmerling Gase team is actually kind of broken up. They've been just running one car most of the year. We had Frankie Muniz throwing his hat into the ring, driving the number 35 car. Patrick Emmerling, the other half of that effort, has now gone over to SS Greenlight and is embarking on his own program there, driving the number 07 over there. So it's just been Joey Gase over there, and they've just been running the one car most of the week. It sounded like they were going to run two cars this coming week at Martinsville in the Xfinity Series race. So in the race at Richmond, he's running, again, not one of the top contenders out there. Neither is Gase-Cram, now driving for Johnny Davis at JD Motorsports there. A couple of different small teams out there, but there is an altercation that happens on the front straightaway. Cram gets behind Joey Gase on the front straightaway. Looked like he almost was locking bumpers with him. Just got into the corner a bit too hard, ends up spinning out Joey Gase into the first corner. Gase backs into the outside wall, and Gase is not happy. As we saw from the pictures on social media, it pushed in the rear clip pretty good, shunted the fuel cell off to the side, even cracked the rear glass on his car as well. But an unfortunate situation there for sure. It trashed the car. He's definitely not going to be able to run it in Martinsville in less than a week. So, he's got reason to be unhappy. And then to have it be Gase-Cram that drove for him before, you can understand the frustrations there. And this on top of all the other frustrations I mentioned earlier that these race cars drivers get into that happen all the time. Now, so the incident happens. Gase comes out of the car. He's okay. But he's clearly, you could tell from just the body language that he's not happy. He's still got his helmet on. He grabs the TV panel, which has now been dislodged from the back of his McGruff-sponsored car, and rips it clean off. And he now throws it at Cram's car as it goes by. He takes a couple steps down the banking there. Anthony Alfredo's car just comes by him there. And then right behind it, you have Cram's, and he throws it. Looked like he was going to try to throw it through the passenger side window. That's been just from conjecture, from what people were looking at. But it ends up hitting the front of the windshield and kind of sliding over the top of it. Maybe messed up the windshield tear-offs on the Cram's car there. And that was basically the situation. So Gase gets brought back into the infield, says that he was going to give Cram a souvenir of that incident. They then spoke to each other after the race, and there have been many interviews Since then, probably way more that Joey Gase and Gase-Cram have had in quite some time. I guess this is what it takes for a lot of the media to talk about some of these guys out there. Yeah, you had that situation. I mean, NASCAR went to the extent of impounding the piece of debris off the car, and this is where the tone of of everything kind of started to go off the rails. Now, I think anybody that has been following the sport for any amount of time is going to see a situation like that, and the first thing you're going to think about is you're like, yeah, right on. Absolutely, I think I will freely admit that myself. I think that any of us that sees any clip on, like, from Bowman Gray Stadium or your local short track or anything like that, where, a wreck like that happens and drivers get angry at each other and, whether they throw their helmet or their heel pads or their gloves or anything like that. 2002 Bristol Night Race, for example, even in the Cup Series, had several incidents happen in one time. And that race has fallen into myth way more than Jeff Gordon ending his losing streak by bumping Rusty Wallace out of the way for just all the crazy stuff that happened in that race. And they get played in all these montages and everything. But we don't want to, at the same time, obviously, you can't pretend that these incidents aren't happening outside the context of course, the Kevin Ward tragedy that happened with Tony Stewart. And a situation very similar with a driver that came out of his car after a controversial on-track incident, was looking to kind of express his frustration. And of course, the tragedy that unfolded after that is something that we've all known about since then. And since then, NASCAR has come up with actually having a rule in place to deter drivers from doing the very same thing, from approaching another car, whether it's to do anything, whether it's to gesture or throw debris on it. The rule is very clear that they have a rule that they specifically want a whole list of things that they don't want the driver to do, and one of those is definitely approaching other cars in traffic. So I don't want to pretend that the rule doesn't exist or that it hasn't been enforced, because it absolutely has. I remember the same weekend it pretty much started pretty quickly, because I believe it was Watkins Glen weekend when the Kevin Ward tragedy happened, because there were a couple of years that Stewart missed Watkins Glen for one reason or another. And J.J. Yaley had a situation where he wanted to gesture at somebody else during the Xfinity race, and he was deterred from that. And that was kind of one of the starting points from that same penalty back then. There are obvious safety issues in the factor. We talk about this on the show a lot here, that I think safety is the first thing you look at with any of these. And I think that, it could certainly be argued. And I think one person pointed this out on social media that, look, what if he slipped? What if Joey Gase slipped while he tried to throw that piece of debris and it falls in front of, Dawson's car, or even just slides a little bit, maybe runs over his leg or something like that. You don't want to think about that, but I mean, there's definitely that risk. You think about how fast these cars go by, when they're running, when they're running on the apron, and it could be freeway speed or neighborhood speed. How close do you want to be to a car in those circumstances there, whatever your motivation may be. But I think the other offsetting part of this is like, okay, well, what should be the proper penalty for it? And as I said on social media after this, I mean, honestly, I kind of was thinking, well, I kind of hope that they really don't have any penalties for this. I think that it's between a couple of small teams. I think that it's already enough of a penalty that Joey Gase is going to have to rebuild this car. I like that Gase-Cram has apparently he's released a new t-shirt, and the proceeds from that are going to Joey Gase's foundation, which is involved with Donate Life. So that's a great effort. If you're interested in that, I believe I retweeted that on my social media, so you can check that out too. There are offsetting interests here at the same time. We certainly want to protect the drivers. You don't want them to be in a situation that's overly dangerous, especially if it's something that's an intentional act, like walking out on a track and, trying to gesture at some other driver out there at the same time. I also do think, though, that at the same time, we shouldn't be expecting these drivers so much to not express themselves in that way or another. And if your concern is so much about people being out there in front of cars going by at certain speeds, well, then you're probably just as frustrated about pit crews, for example. Pit crew members take on that risk for going out there and servicing these cars at any one moment. And anybody could spin out on pit road and you could have a collision. Some pit crew members have, faced very serious injuries from that, and they accept that and they take that as part of it. And these drivers themselves are already engaged in a very dangerous act as being race car drivers themselves. They put in that very same risk just getting in the car with all the safety equipment that they have on. It's you certainly don't want. I think the concern that a lot of people have is, of course, the Kevin Ward situation, which I think had a lot of unique circumstances separate from NASCAR, whether it was the exposed wheels and the way the cars accelerate in sprint car racing, the amount of lighting that was available at the track, the fact that Kevin was wearing a dark uniform. There were a lot of circumstances that made it a much worse situation than I think it would have been at any NASCAR race at the same time. What I think is maybe there should be some kind of middle ground. Maybe if you had, an official standing there with him to make sure if, maybe he's going to go out there and he's going to throw his pads or something, or something like that. You have like somebody just to follow him just to make sure nothing else happens. I don't think that's an unreasonable thing to have happen there too. Some kind of middle ground at the same time, because, I don't think these drivers need their hands held quite as much as, they have under. I think the measures taken since the Kevin Ward tragedy are well-meaning, but I think they're a bit high. And I think that the reason I feel that way is in the response that a lot of people had to this about what the penalty should be. It's like, oh, Gase should be suspended for that. He should be fined for that. It should be like this. It should be that. And again, I just think that, really, what are we punishing here at the same time? If it's a safety violation, yes, you could certainly argue that, but I think it goes two ways. It's like the driver is already engaged in a dangerous activity, it's just being a race car driver. Where's the emergency staff to stand by and make sure he gets back into the ambulance? These incidents here where you have somebody that's throwing a piece of debris or a helmet or something like that, it's always really quick. The guy is standing there and he sees the guy come by, he throws something or he gestures at him, and then you just guide him back into the ambulance. I think that the amount of equipment that is available, again, very big different from the Kevin Ward situation as well. The amount of crew and staff that's available in any of these situations there that can help in some situation, at least in a supervisory role. I think that would be a pretty reasonable solution on this. I think that would be something that maybe they look at. You don't want to have it be something that you actively endorse. You don't want to make it a rule that it's like, okay, well, we're only going to give you like 30 seconds to respond to like a certain driver if you come out. Like that would just be stupid too. I think it's a case of maybe over officiating a bit. I do think that NASCAR has a series of rules that probably were meant to be well-meaning, that, just haven't, that maybe there's a better solution out there, just hasn't been considered yet. And I think that's another part of it too. So I don't know. I mean, I think it's for what's the thing that we're trying to protect against? We're trying to protect against the drivers putting themselves in anything unnecessarily dangerous. And it could be argued, walking out in front of, these race cars out there, whether it's to, throw a piece of debris or something like that. That's going to be a situation. But the other side of it, and